Let's get started. First of all, thanks for joining us for another episode of Catholicism Around the Movies. We have a great movie to talk about, and I hope we have lots to talk about. Just a reminder about what this whole project is of Catholicism around the movies. It's intended to be a forum for the intersection of Catholic studies and film. An opportunity to think about film in the context of Catholic studies and Catholic studies in the context of film. The kind of goal here is for Monica and me to each share a few thoughts, and then really intended to be more of a roundtable discussion about this film. Hope everybody's had a chance to see it or re-see it. And we're very much interested in hearing what you have to say. And so we really encourage you to use the Q&A in the chat to post questions, and we'll get started. Tonight, I'm very excited to have Dr. Monica L. Mercado, Assistant Professor of History at Colgate University, who works on gender, sexuality, race, and Catholicism. She's also an expert in material cultures of religion. And I particularly remember Monica from a great roundtable she helped organize for the ACHA on eBay as a resource for material and cultural history of Catholicism. She's published a number of works on religious postcards, suffragette history, and women at the Catholic Summer School of America at the turn of the last century. And she is currently working on a project entitled An Archive of Girlhood, the Convent Academy in Catholic America. And because of all that, her research and expertise, I thought should just be a natural to have here to talk about Greta Gerwig's film from 2017, Lady Bird. Before we actually get into the movie, I just want to make a brief announcement about the next episode of Catholicism Around the Movies. It will be Wednesday, October 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And the movie we'll be discussing will be the recent film directed by Ethan Hawke, Wildcat, it's a biopic of Flannery O'Connor. I'll have my colleague here at UD, Dr. Una Cadigan, join me as we dive into that film. Like me, Una is her background is in American studies, so it'll be a real Catholic studies meets American studies meets the movies. We'll get into the film itself. We'll get into Flannery O'Connor and her place in American Catholic literature, her place in American literature. We'll also explore the movie's kind of evocation of post-war America and post-war literary culture. The movie even includes that famous line that those of us in Catholic studies are very familiar with by Flannery O'Connor, about the Eucharist. If it's just a symbol, the hell with it. That shows up in this movie. What is that about? Does that portend the end of Catholic studies in some ways? So we'll get into that. We'll also use this film, Wildcat, as an occasion to explore a recent phenomenon I'm calling the return of dead Catholics in American culture. This film, the recent movie about Mother Cabrini, and the documentary on PBS on Teilhard de Chardin. What's all about? What's going on with that, right? I mean, probably just a coincidence, but can we make that coincidence speak to other issues and interests we have in contemporary American Catholic culture and film? So having said that, let's turn to Lady Bird itself. I want to offer three really brief comments before I turn it over to Monica. I'm sure you know the movie was quite well received when it was released in 2017. It was Greta Gerwig's directorial debut, and it enjoyed both critical and popular acclaim. In fact, it wound up high on a number of critics' end of the year top 10 lists. The aggregator site Critics Top 10 actually for 2017 ranks it number 2 for best films of the year, according to its aggregation of many critics. It also won a number of Academy Award nominations for Best Picture, for Gerwig for Best Director, and for Best Screenplay, as well as for Saoirse Ronan for Best Actress, and Laurie Metcalf as supporting actress. It also did well, relatively well, considering it's something of a quasi-indie film. It turned out to be A24, its distributor's biggest hit up to that time. So it enjoyed a real kind of moment and impact. So the three brief comments I want to make are these. One, I'm struck by how the films offer a kind of gentle and kind rendering of Catholicism that's not often seen in the movies. Right, this is not a movie in which Catholicism is a source of a great deal of conflict or as a problem. Catholicism is treated by the film really as a kind of like supportive community, peopled by religious who are caring and compassionate and forgiving. It's a world of ritual and also of theater, right? Catholicism isn't a burden or really a question so much as it is a nurturing background and context. In fact, the Catholic school seems to me functions as a kind of refuge in some ways for Lady Bird from the conflict she's having with her own mother, as well as the kind of economic and class precarity of her own family. The movie is neither the Catholic school is neither a source of critique or, savage satire. And so it's a kind of warm depiction. It's neither a source of critique, but nor is it also a rendering of Catholicism that I think we all became very, very familiar with earlier this century with Catholic schools as sites of abuse. So Lady Bird offers an implicit alternative way of imagining and thinking about Catholic school settings, and the transgressions here are not so much have to do with Catholicism itself, but more with adolescent angst and mother-daughter relations. Secondly, I'm struck by its setting in California. It takes place in Sacramento, right? What Lady Bird refers to as the Midwest of California. And that its setting in California was the first thing that really struck me about the movie. So the movie doesn't trade in the traditional places of American Catholic mythology, right? Of New York or Boston or Long Island, nor is it the ethnic neighborhood. It's someplace else. It's someplace else, right? It's elaborating a different place for Catholicism. And I think that that geographic orientation is kind of interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it, but it seems at least it's expanding the imagined geography of Catholicism in popular imagination. And then finally, Greta Gerwig herself, right, as the director and screenwriter of this film, and her position as insider, outsider. She herself isn't Catholic, but she did go to attend Catholic schools, Catholic high school. And according to her own accounts, she had a very positive experience with Catholic schools. And perhaps this accounts for the film's gentler, kind, or warm depiction of Catholicism. In an interview with Terry Gross, when the movie first came out, she said, "Because Catholicism was my background, I was allowed to love it. I didn't feel like it was something to define myself against," which is an interesting comment. So she wasn't raised Catholic, but she offers a kind of warm portrait to it, which might obscure other dimensions of Catholic schools. So for instance, I think about its rendering of Catholicism and young Catholic women. It's different than the first movie that back in the winter on this show with Katie Hulscher and Matt Kressler of St. Maud, a rather quite different rendering of Catholicism and young women. And so to me, the fact that Gerwig is not Catholic, but is interested in Catholicism highlights, I think, something very interesting, namely that insider-outsider position in regards to Catholicism is often a very generative space in film. Some of the most interesting films have not been made by Catholics. And I think even the question of whether the movie gets Catholicism right or not is not a very interesting question from my point of view. I don't even know what that would mean to say the film gets Catholicism right. but rather the way I think any cinematic treatment of Catholicism, what it gives rise to, what it opens up. And so with that, I'll conclude my comments and turn it over to Monica. Oh, by the way, I should say before I do, yesterday was Monica's birthday, and so I just want to wish her a happy belated birthday, and again thank her for joining us.
AKA why we didn't do this on Wednesday, the 18th. Thank you, Tony, and thanks everyone who's here. I will build on what Tony just said and remind we have the chat open as well as I think a Q&A box. So at any point, not just after we're in conversation, feel free to throw ideas or questions in. I'll keep an eye on that as well as Tony. So I also have 3 things I want to talk about. And maybe it's 3.5 because I want to build on Tony's first point about Catholic ordinariness and watching and rewatching Lady Bird. I don't know why, but I think it's important to make a confession as I begin that I didn't go to Catholic school, but I have now spent 10 years writing about Catholic girls and Catholic girlhood in single-sex Catholic schools quite a lot. Their schooling and the worlds they made in these spaces that put them in community largely with other women, Catholic teaching sisters. And I too, like Tony, was reflecting on the fact that the last time we were together on Zoom, it was to talk about a very different set of movies, Catholic horror. And there's something about those movies where maybe it's easier for people to identify as Catholic or to identify the movie as Catholic. The nuns are nunnier, right? The church is literally darker. The saints glare at you. There's blood and guts. As Tony mentioned, we watched Saint Maud, where the song in the movie trailer, I took a note when we watched it, the song says something like, all the good girls go to hell, right? This is not that. You'd be hard pressed to find hell invoked at Immaculate Heart and Xavier, where Lady Bird and her classmates are at school. And that's why, like Tony, I like this take on the ordinary. I think in 2017, a lot of reviewers noticed it too. Ordinary, hopeful were words I think that were thrown a lot around in the discourse around this film. And that ordinariness strikes me a lot, and I do want to think through it some more. When I posted on social media that we were having this conversation, 2 of my Colgate colleagues actually got into it in a friendly way. One, who is not really religiously affiliated, immediately asked me, wait, what's the Catholic part of that movie? Like, remind me. And this was on Facebook. And our Catholic chaplain chimed in immediately and said, it's one of the most Catholic movies of the last 30 years, like an incredible portrait of what he called normie suburban Catholic school life. Maybe not so suburban. And my other colleague said, oh, right, like, and I had posted one of the promo stills with, Saoirse Ronan's profile, but there's always like a crucifix in the background. And my colleague who didn't really register it as Catholic said, oh, right, like, and I love this observation, this dimension of the movie, she said, registered only minimally with me. Like, there are so many other elements I loved. Like, I think this is such a great movie, and I just didn't really remember that at all. So something I keep mulling over is that instead of being an artifact of Catholic difference, early 21st century Catholic difference, I do wonder if this ordinariness that Tony got us started with is a little subversive. In the opening, the Hail Mary is sort of cut in, and the kids are saying it in the same cadence as the Pledge of Allegiance. Look, Catholics are Americans, what we've been saying all along. the opening homily, the priest's soothing words at the beginning of the school year, if anyone in his teenage flock is listening. He says, we are afraid of what the future will bring. Will we get into the college of our choice? Will we be loved? Will we be liked? Will we succeed? Right? This is gentle preaching, not fire and brimstone. And I guess I wonder, what does it mean that a non-Catholic can watch and even love this movie and not really notice or remember the Catholic parts at all? At the same time, right, Catholic media loved it too. So Tony noted, right, how well reviewed it was, and in like non-Catholic media, right? It got all these award nominations. It had one of the best Rotten Tomato scores. The New York Times called it perfection. But places like America and other sort of traditional Catholic media really fell in love with this film. They called it a rallying cry for Catholic schoolgirls everywhere. America also named Lady Bird the #1 Catholic school movie of all time, just edging out Doubt. And Greta Gerwig herself has called it a love letter to Catholic school. So there's a lot I hope we can talk about. And Tony's given me a few extra minutes to highlight some themes that I have been thinking a lot about as I work and bring to publication my own book on largely 19th and 20th century Catholic girlhoods. So if you'll indulge me, I'll briefly touch on these other three things. 1, women as Catholic storytellers. 2, religion and ritual. And 3, they get shorter as they go down. I want to think about Catholic nostalgia and the idea of the cultural Catholic, a term we don't, I think, use as much anymore as we used to. So let me say a few things about all of this and then get Tony's ideas. And the first idea is women as Catholic storytellers. I loved returning to Lady Bird to contemplate Greta Gerwig's career as a writer and director, and the idea of storytelling about Catholic schools. In my own work, I found actually like a long tradition, I think some of us probably know this, a long tradition of women and Catholic women, Gerwig of course is not Catholic, writing about Catholic schools. Sometimes those stories made it to film. Jane Trahey's 1960 Life with Mother Superior turned Haley Neal's vehicle, The Trouble with Angels, would be a great double feature for Lady Bird, but I digress. And so I'll contextualize this briefly in my own work, right, which links American Catholic history and girlhood studies. The all-girls Catholic school and its spaces of like formal but also informal education are things we see all over Lady Bird, right? Classrooms, the theatrical, right? The auditorium, the chapel. For my girls, it was the gardens and grounds. At Immaculate Heart, it's the parking lot, right? These spaces, I think, or in fact, I argue, have long shaped girls' sense of self in a patriarchal church. They are not typical spaces, I think, of American Catholic history, which is focused largely on the parish school, the parochial school. But girls are also not typically regarded as historical actors in American Catholicism. And so I think if we focus on a place like the fictional Immaculate Heart or the all-girls Catholic school, we follow a new tradition in girlhood studies that affirms that young women are in fact deserving of sustained inquiry, right? That they are then also, they can be religious subjects. They have experiences in religious institutions, some that they entered by choice, others not by choice. So I guess my impetus for always thinking about girlhood and why Lady Bird really intrigues me on rewatching is twofold, which is one, that girls are rarely taken seriously by scholars. And with few exceptions, actually, scholars and even historians have of girlhood have rarely examined religion in conversation with girls. And to get really nerdy for a second, right? We have so much work talking about the importance of women's history, which has grown as a field within our subfield, right? This idea that women are central and present in American Catholicism, even if they lack certain authority. Imagine then the girl, right, who commands the least authority of all. Gerwig imagines her as Lady Bird, the high school senior finding her voice and her place in the world. The culture writer Hunter Harris said Gerwig made a movie about what happens when women talk. So I think I'm interested, right, in this as women writing girls' stories, of girls being at the center of the story, and then Catholic girlhood being at the center of the movie. Gerwig talked in a bunch of her interviews in 2017, people would say to her, why girls? And she would say, like, well, I was interested in what personhood would be for young women. And she would talk about reading and thinking about Lives of the Saints and wondering, like, well, what was a saint like as a teenager? And I love those interviews because the girls that I write about in 19th century America were also trying to think, like, was the Virgin Mary pretty? Like, did she drink tea like them out of, like, there's all kinds of American Catholic storytelling earlier in American Catholic history where women and girls are trying to imagine what other Catholic women and girls' lives were like. This is a movie about female friendship, Lady Bird and Julie and Jenna. It is obviously a movie about mothers and daughters. That was the working title of the film before Lady Bird. It's a movie about the connection between student and sisters, right? One of the most interesting things about having the Catholic school be the site of inquiry. Tony mentioned my material culture affectations, right? It is a movie full of stuff, right? Someone could write a thesis just on all the stuff in Lady Bird's bedroom and in the classroom, in the sacristy and all the places the girls are sort of weaving their way through. Lady Bird is no saint, but she is finding her way through the dramas of teenage life. I'll take maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to say a few things about what else has intrigued me. Tony mentioned religion and ritual. I'm really interested, obviously, in coming of age narratives, right? In some ways, this is a movie full of those classic coming of age stories, right? Middle class girlhood milestones, college applications, homecoming, losing your virginity, going to prom, graduating. But it's also a Catholic year and a Catholic school year. And I think that matters. The plot is kind of structured according to these school rituals, which in the Catholic school environment are almost inseparable from things that we don't see on screen, but like sacramental rituals, the things that students do in Mass, in liturgy and theology class. And Gore has said before that she imagined the movie unfolding in a series of scenes like the Stations of the Cross, which I think is an interesting metaphor. So thinking about storytelling and thinking about ritual leads me to this one kind of sticky, unfounded idea that I'm still working through, which is like 21st century Catholic nostalgia. Perhaps this is actually just a different way of talking about the gentle, kind Catholicism, as Tony started his remarks with. There's something about the not Catholic and the ex-Catholic feeling the pull of the routines, right? The not Catholic disaffected Lady Bird and, going to the church and listening to the choir, in her first weeks at NYU at the very end of the film. And there's some really interesting things we can talk about later. Saoirse Ronan, who was raised Catholic, has talked a little bit about what she found compelling about this character and why she still sometimes goes to mass, even though she doesn't consider herself religious. So I'll stop there, but I just want to say that, I hadn't seen this film in a few years. And so watching it, a couple months after turning in my book manuscript, it was really something to rethink about Gerwig in this movie, taking girls seriously, but also having a lot of fun doing it. I had a lot of fun rewatching this movie. I'm eager to keep talking about all of these things: storytelling, ritual, nostalgia, and Tony's Tony's discussion points to gentle, kind California ordinary Catholicism. So thanks for inviting me, Tony. Let's chat and let's eventually see what else folks want to bring up. But I wonder if if anything I've said
That
means
makes no,
something
you
for
made a
you.
lot, made this was great. Thank you. Yeah, you made a lot of sense. It's so stimulating, so rich. Uh, um, you bring such a sharp eye to the film. You see things I didn't see. That was really, really wonderful. I just want to say your point, particularly about the different kind of spaces that that both, the characters and these girls make and that the places they're in, right? I thought that that's such a great point. You're right. Parking lots, informal spaces, or
Mhm.
spaces in which they kind of make their own, like the scene I'm thinking of in particular, where she and her friend, played by a beanie,
Yeah, Beanie Feldstein.
yeah, yeah. When they're eating the unconsecrated
Yeah,
wafers, and they're talking about sex, you
yeah.
know. I mean, that's just such a great example of what you're talking
Mhm.
about in these kind of scenes. And so, yeah, yeah, the kind of particularly the ways they turn religious spaces into their own
Yeah.
needs,
You,
right? Is I think it's just a really great one. And your
Can
point
I
about,
can I stop you there though? Because I think
yeah, yeah,
what's so interesting to me, when I've been writing mostly about 19th and early 20th century academies, so Catholic boarding schools for the most part, so where girls are living as well as going to school, and I think people are always surprised when I mean, in some ways, that scene always strikes me as like, is anyone really ever snacking on unconsecrated wafers? Like, I have questions about this, but it's a darling scene. Um, but at the same time, and I have to say, what you said in your opening remarks about, right, this is not the kind of critique or the way that we have mostly seen school on screen as a site of abuse. Um, I keep thinking a lot about what it means that I'm studying and writing about girls who are often having a lot of fun and creativity and community. They call these schools their home. The girls that I study in the 19th and 20th century, go back and form alumni associations, are always coming back to talk to the sisters and see their favorite sister. I'm obviously not imagining in an alumni world for Julie and Lady Bird and all those girls, but I think sometimes the things that seem surprising, or again perhaps ordinary in this movie, are things that I've found in historical studies of some of these all women spaces. And you're right, they aren't spaces of critique, and they do feel gentler. I see a question about this. And so I often find myself, I didn't say it here, but often in my writing, I'm making a disclaimer saying, like, I understand, like, in studying this, I recognize that, like, the experiences of Catholic girls are not homogenous ones, right? There's not a monolithic Catholic girlhood or experience of girlhood. And I think I'm writing that in the wake of a different 2002, right? Like a 2002 of, the Boston, papers, like not the 2002 of Lady Bird, and that school year. So I've just made a large digression off one thing you said, but I am, yeah, I like this, the fact that that we see all the spaces, all the different classrooms with all their different decorations and their chalkboards, and the chapel and the sacristy, where it's, totally possible to sneak into before or after class or mass, is super interesting to me.
Yeah, and just before turning over to hear what other people say, oh, I should say not. I don't know whether to that I have to kind of preface this. I too have obviously not been to a Catholic girls' schools. I was not even at a Catholic boys' school. I was not even I went to public schools my whole period. So
Aha.
I would be very interested if anybody, how this movie lands for people who may have been, products of Catholic school. But I just want to make one comment about something you said, which I think is so spot on. The movie takes girls as religious subjects seriously, as a part of, Catholic experience, Catholic culture, Catholic history, really, and you know, it just challenges that the notions that's so much embedded. I'm thinking particularly often in Hollywood films that equate a kind of Catholicism with men masculinity and their own kind of either they become heroic or they become very much battling with it. And this is very different. This is very different, and you've described it so well, I think.
Should we look at some questions or should we?
Yes. Well, let's see. So, yeah, Dennis, I find it interesting that Lady Bird and her parents are not Catholic. Perhaps they are kinder to the church than insiders. Also interesting why they chose the school. Perceived safety of the schools. Uh, you would get stabbed at a public school. Yeah, that's a good point. But not moral teachings. Mom just says Lady Bird should wait until college for sex, not until marriage. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
an observation.
it's so interesting. So it gets back, in some ways, Tony, to your point about Gerwig's insider outsiderness. In revisiting, I actually, I've always had a little file of of media about this movie after it came out. Because it was when I was just starting to work on my book project. And when I was looking back at it today, I saw how studiously Greta Gerwig kept saying, like, this is not autobiographical, but obviously, like, I went to this kind of school. I have a lot of love for this kind of school. And I think, yeah, I think this first question of Dennis is super interesting because we're meant to know that nobody's particularly a good Catholic, and it's kind of obvious, I guess, to us that Lady Bird and her family are not Catholic at all. And right, the school was, as Catholic school often is in 21st century America, like a, a deliberate choice by non-Catholic families for the reasons that Dennis notes. But at the same, I think for me, that's why I think even though it's just one character, the character of Sister Sarah Joan is so interesting to me because, I mean, again, she's not played for laughs or for horror, but she is clearly like a little bit of like a moral compass for Lady Bird. And I don't know, to me their scenes always feel like the most Catholic to me, and also like the most, they're not preachy, but they are a place where there is sort of a sense that maybe something that we could call Catholic is going on. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here, but I'm really interested in the ways that we see Lady Bird interacting with her because more than chomping on the wafers or looking incredibly bored at mass like every 17-year-old. I don't know. I think those are really interesting places in the movie where clearly Sister Sarah Jones sees Lady Bird
Right.
in her defiance and potential. And I think
Right.
those scenes are really interesting in there. But maybe I'm reading too much Catholicness into those scenes.
But it's also interesting too, just this idea of her own. She's not Catholic. It seems as though the movie is formative for her in some ways because when she does go to NYU at the end, she engages in, and I forget that I don't have the dialogue right, but when she's at a party with this guy and they're getting drunk, and they engage in a little bit of a theological discussion, right? Or
Right.
he doesn't, but she does, and
Yeah,
says something about like you never question your name, but you will question God. And
yeah,
so I might not have that right.
yeah.
It is interesting that she carries something about these questions about, I don't know if you want to be, maybe it's too loose to call it theological or something, but this character does bring it with her as she goes to New York, which,
Yeah.
you were talking about like classic kind of, you know,
Yeah, the
elements
coming of
of coming
age.
of. She goes to New York. And why does she want to go to New York? Because that's where writers are,
Yeah.
right? That it's sophisticated and cosmopolitan, and she wants to get out of the Midwest of California. But there is this kind of sense where she she hasn't completely left. It's still somehow part of her identity, this
Yeah.
religious stuff, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, oh, I was going to say, I'll say two more things to Dennis's first question, and then we can move on. One is I mentioned that Saoirse Ronan has talked a little bit about what she was thinking when she played the character, and Ronan was raised Catholic, but she said like I'm not religious, but I always thought that for Lady Bird, church or Catholicism meant a little bit of a home, like it reminds her of her childhood, which she feels like she's now like like a woman making strides in New York. I'd like that there's something about home and sanctuary in that last scene of where she goes to be reminded of her past, her family, like her childhood. And I think that's super interesting. And I also think, I mean, again, not to I keep saying this is a nerdy move. I'm like surrounded by book drafts. In 19th and early 20th century America, Catholic girls' schools were full of non-Catholics who felt and joined alumni associations and were like the women who like came back and still wanted to like see their sisters and their classmates and still hosted teas and events and raised money. So in some ways too, this is nothing new. That there were lots of Protestant daughters, for good or ill, at Catholic women's schools, almost as long as I've been around. And I'm interested in those kinds of connections.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So we got a couple questions here. I'm going to kind of combine them. Tim's asking about Monica. Could we hear your thoughts on the nuns, right? Where does Lady Bird fit into the pantheon of nun movies? And then Una in the chat asks, you know, uh, you know, she can't help it. She says, like, think about, Dairy Girls. And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
I'll let you tackle those.
Oh man, this is hilarious, Una, because the other day I was on a research trip researching girls in Philadelphia, and I was thinking about tonight, and I was like, oh man, like why are we like we should be talking about Dairy Girls too, and then I didn't, and I was thinking about like the again, I feel like on this bingo card of tonight, gentle has sort of showed up. Like, there's what do we the humor of Dairy Girls, which is not the humor of Lady Bird. It's something I'm going to keep talking about or thinking about while I try to answer and get Tony to help me answer Tim's question. And I'm going to take the second part of this first. Where does Lady Bird fit in the pantheon of nun movies? I mean, again, I was really happy that I think a podcast over at America Magazine did this for me. They called it, Catholic school movies. But I think, there was so much work done, I would say maybe like 10 or 15 years ago about like the figure of the Catholic sister in American popular culture, books, articles, things, nun dolls, the flying nun, TV shows, movies. And so like I said, Sister Sarah Joan is not a huge part in this movie, but she's so goddamn delightful. What the nun mobile gets, sort of, their prank, um, married to Jesus, and she tells Lady Bird why the sister saw that was actually kind of hilarious. The way that she puts the girls in a circle in the classroom. I don't know whose high school classroom in 2002 was arranged in chairs into a circle. She's a different kind of nun, even though she's in full habit, right? I mean, which I am guessing is kind of an aesthetic choice on Gerwig's part. So I'm curious what Tony would say too. I really do think this sits with my other current obsession, which I mentioned, The Trouble with Angels, the Haley Mills movie, and its writer, Jane Trahey, who's this kind of like mid-century gal about town. That movie and that book is a collection of like humorous, loving short stories about the convent academy. And I think it fits very closely with Lady Bird in that the girls are getting into a little bit of trouble, but they actually love being there. And the sisters are stern, but they're actually also quite loving and teaching them with good cheer and a sense of community. Anyway, I won't do. I mean, I'm thinking about all kinds of movies. I would never rank them. I'm not a good movie ranker. But I'd be curious what other people think, Tony and folks, if they want to put their favorite nun movies in the chat. But I'll just say one last thing about Tim's first question, and then I'm curious what Tony thinks. The gentle, ordinary California. I wrote this down. I wrote Tony's first thoughts down as ordinary, warm California. And it reminds me of a question I often get about my own work, which is, how is this Catholic? It's like, and I get this mostly from non-Catholic historians, but also sometimes in Catholic spaces. And I think I've talked about this with other ACHA folks from time to time. Like, when Catholics don't look like Catholics because they look like so ordinary, right? Like, I think it's really interesting because I think we've often, and by we, I mean even American Catholic historians, have neglected to attend to the privilege and prosperity of many white American Catholics across the long scope of American Catholic history. So I think sometimes that's simply like confusing to see. I think the Californianess and the Sacramento-ness of it, which is so Gerwig, is really interesting. And I wish we had a California person to help us out on this, the Californianess of it all. But ordinary, warm California Catholicism, like it's Catholicism, even if it doesn't look like what we maybe think Catholicism
Yes.
should look like.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, right. I mean, it's not, of course, that the Catholic has to look some way, right? And this this is, I mean, what's so interesting, right? Catholicism is like a context. The Catholic school is the context. It's not necessarily the foreground, even though at some moments visually it is. And that's just really interesting, a kind of almost a metaphor or something to think about actually the complexities of Catholicism. Catholicism isn't always the most important thing in
Yeah.
in a movie or even in a person's or even a Catholic's experience, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that
Tony,
to me
what?
is
Oh,
very
yeah.
interesting. That's to me is
Tony,
really
would you rank any nun movies for Tim? Do you have
well,
any
yeah, I would just say,
faves?
okay, this is not the nun story, right?
Right.
And this is again, this is not a kind of angst-ridden story about some, like that movie where by the end Audrey Hepburn's left, and of course, this is you know, the Bells of St. Mary's, right? I mean, and Ingrid Bergman. I mean, that was as interesting a movie because it was Ingrid Bergman, right?
Mhm.
In some ways, and so yeah, I was struck, in Lady Bird, the nun. You remember during the dance, and she says something like 6 inches for the Holy Spirit.
So 1950s.
Yeah, right. I was wondering whether this, I mean, it seemed so precise, I wonder whether that was actually used, right? I don't know. I don't know. But it does kind of harken back to almost like in an ironic way, that older kind of Catholic schoolgirl school kind of police.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. There's a lot. I mean, I've read a lot of 20th century Catholic memoirs. Everyone gone to get published after Mary McCarthy, and so there's if you look up a good Catholic girl in your library catalog, you'll find all kinds of memoir collections, which would tell you that that Sixteenth Rule is very much in play. The last thing I'll say to Una's question before we move on is that I keep thinking, I said I was trying to think through Catholic difference, and there's something about Dairy Girls and its setting, right, in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where there's so much play with the idea of Catholic difference, right? The one Protestant cousin, like the constant sort of intrusion of the political violence of the Troubles into the girls' school life. But yeah, I have to say that now I want to rewatch Dairy Girls after watching and talking about Lady Bird so much. So it's a very unsatisfying answer for Una, but I think it's a great question.
Okay. Yeah, sorry if I'm fading or getting dark. It's because it's getting dark here in Dayton, Ohio. But we have two really interesting questions here. Dennis asked another one, and then Gavin. Um, Dennis asked, one thing I thought missing was the heavy sports culture in Catholic high school. The football coach theater substitute was funny, but there was nothing else. At recent 50 high school reunion, there was a lot of reliving past football glory. Sounds like Dennis went to Catholic, a Catholic high school. Yeah, I mean, I didn't, but yeah, the Catholic, I mean, Catholic high school sports is so associated in popular culture. Well, Catholic high schools are so associated with sports, right? In some ways, going way back, the CYO boxing tournaments, right? And then, of course, you have the football that, the whole Notre Dame phenomenon kind of taps into. But that's a really good point. And perhaps it's because this is, centering, a young, a Catholic girl, high school girl, and it's an all-girls school. But yeah, I mean, Monica, I don't know what you
Yeah,
make of
no,
that,
it's
but I
it's
do think
no,
that's an
it's
interesting
it's
point.
interesting too, right? The priest coach substitute for the drama club leader, is played for
I'll be
laughs.
right back.
Yeah, as Dennis notes. Um, but I do think, right, that some of this tells me that this movie, if not autobiographical, has a lot of Gerwig in it. And it's also about teenagers who imagine themselves kind of as outsiders, right? Lady Bird and her, and Julie, right? The boys, be it Danny, the Sondheim, Merrily We Roll Along star, or his classmate, the disaffected wannabe Howard Zinn reading anarchist, right? Like we're kind of getting that other slice of life at school. Like these are not kids who are playing football or going to the games on the weekends. And so, yeah, Dennis is right. Like this is in some ways a huge part of Catholic school culture that we're not seeing, but we're seeing this other kind, of teamwork and community making that offers, a way to see the school from a different point of view. And again, I love seeing it in my own work. There's so much theater in 19th and 20th century Catholic girls' schools. The nuns are writing shit. I mean, there's no Sondheim, but like the nuns are writing plays. Like the girls are acting in plays, boys are acting in plays. There's so much of the theater as a space. We don't see it here, but as a space actually for contemplating Catholicism. A lot of the earlier school theater groups took up like really kind of religious subjects. But I do think the theater here is played both for like, to see where the disaffected kids go, which is a real theme in high school drama club. And played for laughs. Beanie Feldstein singing that hymn for her audition. It makes me smile every time.
Right. And
Thanks,
not just
Dennis, for that question.
and not just in Catholic high school, right? Theater is always a kind of place for kids who
Yeah,
don't fit into,
yeah,
or one place where they
yeah.
can, particularly for the kids who aren't really athletically inclined. And then Gavin asked this question. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Gavin. He writes, I love the scene where the sister tells Lady Bird that her disparaging description of Sacramento is actually love because it means she's paying attention. Is Gerwig's ability to, quote unquote, pay attention to the late capitalist American city a unique product of Catholic education? As geographies of nowhere proliferate, does a Catholic education or the space of Catholic education, art, stained glass chapel, help you to place yourself within the world? And Gavin, thank you very much, because I think you're helping to articulate something that was only kind of inchoate in my own mind, but trying to think about this space of the Sacramento and its landscape. And by the way, Gerwig has said that she really does like Sacramento, right? And so it is interesting that she's taking this place, which, um, has been disparaged. You think of the West Coast, this isn't the West Coast. This doesn't have the San Francisco or LA kind of vibe to it, right? It's Sacramento. And your point about geographies of nowhere, and I guess I would say two things. I think you're onto something where it's a Catholic space becomes something that becomes more meaningful in spaces that are now more highways and things like that. But also her own willingness to kind of attend to this space and trying to retrieve it from a nowhere place. When at the end, when she's, Lady Bird is driving around, on the highway, I found that a really kind of interesting scene in which she is now kind of, in some ways, claiming this city for herself, of course, in an automobile. And yeah, so there's just some thoughts about this really great question about how the movie is taking seriously these kind of places that seem like they're nowhere.
Yeah, here's where else. So I'm drinking out of my Barnard mug today because Greta Gerwig, like me, went to Barnard College in New York. And so here, not at the same time, she's younger than me. But here I would say that I think some of the shared autobiography, excuse me, of Lady Bird and Greta Gerwig helped me think through this question, because I think there is something about going cross country, right? About leaving at 18 from Sacramento to go to New York City, where Barnard is, to college. That, to go from a no place to a some place that you really wanted to be, or in Lady Bird, has been imagining in her mind's eye, in this incredibly fraught time, 2002, 2003. I think there's something a little bit there. I can imagine in sort of going to the place you always wanted to be, the big place, the special place, that makes you really rethink the no place that you started with, and have a bit more affection and attention. I love that line too, Gavin. I'm glad you brought it up. And it's also one of the Lady Bird doesn't believe it, but it is a kind of meditation that again feels a little bit Catholic to me too, or like a sort of, suggestion that Lady Bird has been meditating on this thing, even if it doesn't seem like, she's paying much attention to anything at all, be it math or, all the things that she's not particularly brilliant at. But I do think there's something, something about the reorientation or the re-looking at Sacramento from the vantage point of New York, which, sort of ends up in the movie at the very end as well. But yeah, I'd love to think about that being part of Catholic education and part of this thing I can't quite define yet, come back to me in a few years, about Catholic nostalgia, and even being able to inhabit that if you're not Catholic.
Yeah, yeah, that kind of longing for Catholic. Well, we kind of do see it more widely, don't we? Right? In the
Yeah,
kind of the larger kind of political culture we're living through right now.
so true.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, Gavin, thank you. That your question really does raise helps me think about what the significance of this California location, Sacramento, might provoke.
oh,
So
Christina
yeah,
has a very good point in the chat as we
yeah,
start
you
to
want to read
wind
it?
down.
You want to read
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. Thank you, Christina. Christina says, "Have any of you seen Real Women Have Curves, 2002? I wonder if it is a source text for Gerwig." I've been thinking about this a lot, Christina, um, in part because I don't have a citation for this, but I feel like this has been part of the Greta Gerwig dialogue since Lady Bird. And of course, as Tony mentioned, this was her directorial debut. She was a screenwriter. She'd certainly acted in and been in films before this, but this trio of Gerwig
Mm,
movies, Lady Bird, Little Women, 2019, and then Barbie, have been really critiqued for their persistent whiteness, and a sort of like universal, be it girlhood, a universal womanhood, a universal feminism, that critics, and particularly really important, I think, like critics who are women of color have been saying all along since Lady Bird, like, what about other stories? So I wonder too. I've never seen Gerwig mention Real Women Have Curves. Obviously, America Ferrara is a contemporary and a colleague of Gerwig's, so I'm sure she's seen it. I don't think she's ever talked about it, but I think this discourse came a lot up during Little Women, and again in Barbie, and I've been thinking about it in terms of Lady Bird, in terms of like the American girl can be Catholic, but she has to be white, right? And we don't see in the school a lot of other diversity. So when we're talking about like this being like an text for girlhood, what are we really saying? There's a great article from Princess Weeks, the writer Princess Weeks, about Little Women and Gerwig, and the whiteness of the all-American girl, that if I had the link, I'd drop into the chat, but I'd encourage people to Google. It's really, really interesting. And it's something that I've thought about a lot, mostly because I ended up writing a book about white girlhood, and I never thought that's what I would end up doing. But I think there's something about, Lady Bird is a text about a sort of middle class family struggling to keep their hold on the middle class. But Lady Bird has a scholarship, and she has all the privilege of being at Immaculate Heart. And I think there's something really interesting about, Catholic privilege, that we often don't think of. Real Women Have Curves is a very different movie. It would also be really interesting to watch in conversation with this. So I thank you, Christina, for that question.
yes, thank you. Yeah, and actually, thinking about the last question about how the school becomes this kind of refuge, right? An escape from wider social realities and differences, that the school can provide. Okay, so
Kathleen, I love it.
Kathleen, oh, this is great. She says, folks, the name is Sacramento. Tactile, real place worthy of contemplation. Thank you very much. That's great. Yes, right. I
I
mean,
love a close reading as we get to the
yes,
end of our
that
evening together.
that's thank you, Kathleen. That's very useful, and it's very sharp. Thank you. Yeah, so we're just about at 8 o'clock. Any other questions? Comments? I don't see any in the um chat or the Q&A. No, I think we're done. Monica, do you want to give any final thoughts before I just say something?
Well, I mean, I love that we have all sat here and engaged with this movie, which I think because it is quiet, gentle, warm, like is important in the Greta Gerwig oeuvre, but I don't think gets a lot of, you know, gets a lot of play these days. And I think it's a really interesting
Mhm.
text for lots of reasons. And so I just really appreciate everyone's questions and sort of engaging with the movie and engaging with modern girlhood and its, historical antecedents. I think all the kind, weird, semi-rebellious friendship making and breaking, like these, as I call them, sort of dramas of teenager girlhood life, make for great cinema. And I think this movie is really special, and I've appreciated having the chance to talk about all of these ideas and my half-baked ones and my more baked ones with the group of you and with you, Tony.
Well, I want to thank you again, Monica, because you really brought a wealth of kind of thought and perception and perspective that drew things out in this movie that I didn't see, and so this is really great, and it's so wonderful to have you, with your own research and your book, you bring that to this movie, and I want to thank everybody who attended and asked such good questions. I really appreciate that. This is the kind of the goal for this project of having collective discussion about movies and about Catholicism and um, how they help to mutually illuminate each other or at least raise some interesting questions. And just to conclude, I just want to remind people about the next episode of Catholicism Around the Movies, which will be with Una Cadigan. And the movie will be Wildcat, which last time I checked, you can see it, you can find it on Amazon Prime. Came out last year, directed by Ethan Hawke, about Flannery O'Connor. We'll have lots to talk about. Even if you haven't read any Flannery O'Connor, that's okay. There's really no gatekeeping here. But watch the movie and be looking forward to what people have to think about the movie. And so till then, we'll sign off. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Good night.
Okay. Okay. But Monica,